Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to get a real potpourri of issues and cover a lot of different areas. We're going to talk about what's going on in Timor-Leste, East Timor, as well as some of the programs that are being developed to combat climate change and to reduce poverty. My guest today is an expert on all of these issues. Dr. Abraham Joseph was Senior Socio-Economic Affairs Advisor in the United Nations Integrated Mission in Timor-Leste, East Timor, formerly with the Department for Economic and Social Affairs. He has written a book, or co-authored it, on Timor-Leste, the history and development of Asia's newest nations. And I might just show the book now because it's really an excellent read. It's one that if anybody's interested in this area of the world, I would certainly encourage you to take a look at that. But be that aside, Dr. Joseph, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's go right into your book. It's a very interesting book. We've talked about it before. If our viewers go to our website back about 3 years, they'll hear a little more of an overview of it. But what was the purpose of writing this book when you decided to focus on Timor-Leste? Of course, you're an expert in that area, but why did you decide to do that?
Well, Timor-Leste is a success story of the United Nations. And we know that there are a number of post-conflict countries that are still reeling under crisis. And there is a country where the UN system worked very effectively with the bilaterals and multilaterals and have brought success to the country. And the country moved from crisis to recovery to development in a period of 12 years.
And the UN played a critical role in doing that through peacekeeping and also peace-building activities and helping to administer the government. What is the current status? So years ago in the late 90s, we heard a lot about Timor-Leste and their desire to separate, if you will, or be independent of Indonesia. What is the current status today? How are things going in that country?
Well, Timor-Leste right now has moved from, as I mentioned, from crisis to recovery to development. Now it is with its oil resources that it has discovered offshore, it's trying to build up its economy. There have been successes during the past years. If you take the GDP growth from 2007 to 2016, it was 6.5%. But after that, in 2017 and 18, there was a slowdown. And this year, we are expecting that the economy may move up. But the most critical aspect is the oil resources which they have from 2 oil wells, which it is depleting. And the revenue from that has been coming down. So they really need to focus more on non-oil production. For example, like small and medium enterprise development, so that more employment could be generated, and also on developing tourism. There's good potential for that, and also agribusiness. So if they can focus on these areas, they could sustain the growth. But the most interesting aspect is that they were able to lay a good foundation for democracy in the country, and they have been able to maintain peace and security in the country. Yeah.
That's very important. Peace, security, and stability are rare commodities today in many parts of the world, but luckily they were able to do that. And as you mentioned, obviously any country that depends upon a primary source of revenue, be it oil or coal or gas or whatever it may be, probably should think about diversifying, because once that market goes down, then they've run into problems. Well, now you've been with the United Nations, you are retired from the UN now, but you worked with the UN for many years, but you're still involved in doing a variety of things. You know the UN very well. Let's talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals. I mentioned that, or mentioned poverty earlier, climate change, and of course, if we think back to 2015 when the UN General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 logical, practical, measurable goals to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to combat climate change, to provide inclusive quality education, those types of things. They're today are underway, and they're going to run from 2016 to 2030. You have been involved in some really interesting outreach on the part of the Department of Global Communication, I guess it is, used to be the old
Correct,
Department of Public Information.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. We'll get into the goals. We'll talk a little bit about some of the goals, and then what have you been doing to reach out to help inform people about them?
Well, the SDGs have started on a good footing, I should say, because they were consultation with the development partners, unlike the MDGs. MDGs, as you know, the NGO, civil society organization, private sector, they were quite annoyed because they were not consulted when the MDGs was adopted.
These are the Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015. Right, to reduce poverty by 50% and reverse AIDS, that type of thing.
That's right.
Okay.
But for the SDGs, there was wide consultations. It started in 2012 onwards. Consultation with the NGO, civil society, and the private sector, foundations, academic institutions, they were all involved. So now they are involved in also the ownership of the SDGs. We can see that when the SDG meetings do take place over here, there is very active participation of the NGOs and civil society organizations and the private sector also. But now only 11 years remain to achieve the goals. So there is need for the private sector and also the NGO civil society organizations to work much more effectively in the coming years so that the goals could be achieved by 2030. The UN has also set up some platforms. As you know, the Global Compact has a platform for the private sector for partnership. Then if you take UN academic impact, for there's a platform for partnership with the universities, and the NGOs too have a platform with the Global Department for Global Communication. And if you take on the gender issues too, the UN Women also have a platform for partnership. So those NGOs or private sector or the academic institutions that want to work with any of the UN system organizations, they can register in the respective platforms, like UNDP, WHO, ILO. They have they have all platform under the UN system platforms.
Now, you mentioned about NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and there are literally tens of thousands of them out there that are supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. You talk with people in Rotary International, they're supporting some of them, Lions International, faith-based groups, Kiwanis International, just on across the board. But so many of the folks out there, the headquarters, they're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. Many people have heard about them, but still the rank and file members, a lot of them have never heard about them. But you went to, what I found fascinating, you were telling me about you went to a couple of universities in this area to address the students. What were some of your experiences with the students? Did they, and these were advanced students, I believe, graduate school perhaps, how did they perceive them? Had they ever heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Were they interested in them? What was your experience?
Yes, I did. I got opportunity to speak to university and college students, and also with the NGO group, and also to the private sector. But talking to the students, what I observed was that many of them, first of all, have not heard about the MDGs, and on the SDGs, some of them have heard, but they do not know how many goals there are. And they were not aware about also how the UN works. In fact, I have to explain that the UN headquarters deals with global policy formulation. And then we have 32 agencies. These are the implementing arms of the UN. And they carry out implementation in the different respective areas, like UNICEF working on children, WHO working on health, ILO on labor issues, and so on and so forth. So this was completely surprising to them. I had a very good interaction with the students, and they did ask me also how they can also be involved in the SDGs. So I did explain to them. They can even as an individual itself, they can also contribute. For example, if one is studying law, they can help in legal matters within their community, especially the poor and downtrodden that are there that needs help. Or if one can give help to like children that in schools or in colleges that need some help in their studies. And if as an institution also they could contribute. For example, I mentioned to them that there are some engineering colleges that are doing work in constructing low-cost houses for the people living in slums, and giving it as free of cost to the people. And then also on waste management, they could also help, to clean up, to work within the community and clean up. So I did explain all these things, and so they were quite enthusiastic when I mentioned about they could also be involved. And I also reminded them the United Nations does not belong to belong to the governments. The charter says we the peoples. Then we people, that includes everybody. Everybody is involved. And I also did mention that the SDGs, the ownership is taken by everybody. It's not by the governments itself. Everyone should be involved in the implementation so that there will be global prosperity and also well-being for everybody. In fact, the slogan is "Leaving no one behind." I told them. Yeah. So they were really taken aback by my explanation that they could also, instead of standing from far, they could also participate in the whole process of SDGs. I told them they can even come here to the UN and make presentation on their projects, because we the UN Academic Impact do every 6 months have a meeting where the academic institutions could come and make their presentations on the projects. And if you want to see the projects that are undertaken by the academic institution, if you go into the UN academic website, you can see the projects that are undertaken by various academic institutions.
Well, those were certainly specific recommendations on what they could do to be involved, and they're very helpful. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website, you like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a wide range of issues being confronted by the United Nations and how the United Nations impacts our lives, in many cases every day. My guest today is Dr. Abraham Joseph. Dr. Joseph was a Senior Socio-Economic Affairs Advisor in the United Nations Integrated Mission in Timor-Leste. Dr. Joseph, we were talking about, I won't stay on the students much longer, but I'm just curious, were you able to share information with them about how the UN is actually on the front line in many cases? I think a lot of people have this mythical idea that the UN is just a bunch of bureaucrats wearing pinstripe suits sitting in New York or Geneva or Vienna or whatever, but you've got people on the front line, the UN World Food Program, the UN Children's Fund, as you mentioned earlier, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, being involved with Rotary International to eliminate the scourge of polio. Were they aware of those programs when you mentioned them, or some of them? You didn't mention all of them.
I did in my presentations. I always explain also my experience in the field. I have been also in the field helping in the implementation of the UN programs. So how we have worked as partners, like WHO and also UNDP and UNICEF, the contributions they have made. So I did explain to them about the work they have done, and that we work in cooperation with each other, all the UN system organizations in the field under the UN resident coordinator. And the impact we have made, for example, bringing down infant mortality, maternal mortality, and also mobilizing resources for setting up clinics. I'm citing about Timor-Leste, for example, where I was. There were some clinics in rural areas where we were able to mobilize resources, and when people earlier used to walk for miles to the district headquarters for treatment and all that. This is very close to their residences. So the UN has done a lot of work in the field in in providing services to the people and also building their capacities.
Exactly. And it comes as a surprise to a lot of folks when they find out, too, that not only these UN employees are on the front lines in Syria and war zones, that type of thing, helping deliver food or medicine, whatever the case might be, or help maternal and child health care programs, but the UN helps to move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information every day in international space. Anybody that's flown internationally has been assisted by a UN agency, or you've taken a cruise. It's a UN agency, the International Maritime Organization, that brings the countries together to focus on the rules and regulations to move safely. But we could go on and on about that. Well, let's talk about climate change. It seems like every discussion we always focus on climate change. Was that an issue that you mentioned to them, or how do you perceive that this is a very important part of one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to hopefully slow down? I don't think we're going to reverse it, but slow down climate change. Did you have a chance to get into that with the students, or what are your perspectives on that?
Well, I did also speak to the students and also to the NGOs and the private sector audiences. Climate change, it has been acknowledged that countries have to take action. They have to abide by the Paris Agreement. There were 197 parties that have signed to the agreement that they will try to bring down the temperature, global temperature, below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But as of today, things have not improved. Rather, it looks like we may be going towards 2 degrees Celsius. The IPCC report, probably you may have seen the report. They brought out 2 reports, and it's an alarm to the countries that it might create more global disasters if we don't take timely action. And even the Secretary General has also very clearly mentioned that there's no plan B for planet Earth. So action have to be taken by countries so that the gas emissions can be reduced and we can bring down the global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's a very important issue because we can see what is happening around the world. Even in Mozambique, there was very recently, you may have read about the huge floods. And then last year in Japan, and then in southwestern coast of India, Kerala, where my parents come from, there were never such flood in the past 100 years. It has created so many deaths and infrastructure collapses, residences destroyed. And there was a figure which I saw, more than 10,000 people perished last year itself, 10,000. And 70 million people were affected last year by these natural disasters. So you see the intensity of the situation. And I hope that countries may take it very seriously, and there is going to be a climate summit in September during the time of the General Assembly. So let us hope that the countries will be further awakened by the summit to take urgent actions.
And you were right. You mentioned the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think they put out 5 reports, I believe, but whatever the last one was, 5 or 6, whatever, they said we have like 12 to 14 years before we hit that tipping point where we will go and there'll be no return because the ice will be melted and it's not going to come back. It simply will not come back. You mentioned these natural disasters. They're getting more frequent, they're getting more violent. All of the scientists seem to be in agreement on that. It's all a large part of this big climate change, global warming situation. In the last couple of minutes that we have left, what does that tell us about disaster risk discussions? I know insurance companies deal with this, humans deal with it every day if you're in the middle of a cyclone in southeastern Africa or something like that. But what does that tell us we need to do in the disaster risk area? Well,
they have to put in place a disaster management, risk management, offices in the various countries. I mean, it has to be what you call from not only at the federal level, but it has to be linked also with the states and also at the local level, which is very essential, so that there is proper coordination. This is one, and then there have to be a toolkit for disaster risk management for each country. This is another, and then the capacities also need to be built, human capacities. If you take even in Kerala, in the southwestern coast of India, when I was there, they told me that they don't have even human capacity. What is important is that in the universities there have to be a curriculum on disaster risk management. The courses should be formulated in universities. I mean, it's not only I'm talking of Kerala, but in other developing countries too. Many of the developing countries do not have adequate human and institutional capacities, so that needs to be built. What is also important is monitoring the rainfall, and also analyzing is very important. And I'm not very sure that many countries are doing it and have also the capability. And this is where the UN system, as well as bilaterals and multilaterals, could also come to the assistance of countries that needs those kind of support measures. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think you summed it up very nicely as a good way to end the program. You said the bilaterals, one-to-one agreement or relationships, multilaterals, bringing all the parties together under one roof. And that, of course, is what the United Nations does. UN is not a perfect organization, but it's the only game in town that brings all 193 countries of the world together to deal with these problems, to deal with poverty, to deal with climate change in particular, because this is one that is probably the greatest threat to the planet. And if the scientists are correct, that if this planet, they say by 2100, if we stay on the same trajectory, it will be uninhabitable. But now they're starting to revise their statistics and look at their studies and saying it's happening even faster than we thought. The ice is melting faster, the seas are rising, we see desertification taking place, that it's just turning into a snowball effect. And once it reaches that point, a crescendo, we'll never be able to stop it, and then it'll be entirely too late. But Dr. Joseph, I want to thank you so very much for bringing us up to date on what's going on, and I want to thank you for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.